Indian colonization is very unique because it has economic roots and it spans over a large subcontinent of a country. And the fact that India is so large as it is today is very important when thinking about colonization. As we should. So, before India was ever colonized, there was a lot of growing economic activity in India before the British, who eventually colonized India, ever gained political power. Economic activity can be classified as trade between Europe and India because India had many coveted spices, in particular pepper, which Europeans grew to covet. Indian trade had been going for a long time before colonization ever began, and most trade from Europeans in India is exemplified in these pictures. These are trading posts of Portuguese, who are one big trading power in India, and the Dutch. And these trading posts were called factories. That's what they were nicknamed, because they were trading center points where pretty much all trade happened and all shipping happened of this trade. However, these trading posts, the Portuguese and the Dutch were never colonizers of India because these trading posts never had political power. They only had economic stature. And when the British eventually began colonizing India, it started with these trading posts but grew into something very different, which we will explore in the coming slides. The British East India Company has often been referred to as the company that grew into a nation. And this is an accurate depiction because the British East India Company started as a trade company who, once they gained power through winning, being the victors in disputes with other trading powers in India, they began to gain political power. The British East India Company began expanding through India initially so as to gain extra trade rights and get an upper hand on their competitors, and they continued doing so, especially when they were given favors by the British government. The British government signed a bill that granted them access to mint money and essentially let them function as a separate political body, where they could have their own army and they could capture territory and they could make war, sign treaties, etc. But as you can see in these pictures, this is what the British East India Company managed to do with their power. The territories in pink are direct British East India Company territories that they directly controlled, whereas the yellow territories, while they were still ruled by separate Indian princes, the British East India Company still had access to these territories. They just did not have the same level of trade rights. The framework and the general demographic of this map, as in what the British East India Company owned directly versus what they owned indirectly, is important because this demographic remains similar and constant to the demographic of which the British government directly owned when they took the assets from the East India Trade Company. Now, they did that in 1857 and 1858 when there was the Indian Rebellion at the time against the East India Trade Company and their armies. And the East India Trade Company did not have much leverage in this dispute because, A, their armies were not able to calm the rebellion and solve the problem, and B, they were having disagreements with the British government, which technically owned them. Now, the British government essentially let the British East India Company become its own separate branch, controlling India as a British territory. And the British East India Company was quite independent, except for the fact that the British government wanted to use their profits. And it couldn't do that if it granted the British East India Company full independence as a political body. Now, this is what the British East India Company wanted. They wanted full independence, which the British government would not grant them. Now, the British East India Company, keep in mind, was already a company that had become a political body because they had their own seat in Parliament, They had their own seat in Parliament in the British government already, and they had all the access to mint money and other privileges, as we talked about before. But when this happened, the dispute was solved when the British government took all the assets away from the British East India Company, which was eventually dissolved 10 years later, and that is when official British rule began in India. When the British officially resumed control over India from the East India Trade Company in 1857, the British demographic of rule over India was quite similar to that of which the territories of the British East India Trade Company consisted of. As we saw before in the maps, the pink territories were areas which the British East India Trade Company directly conquered, whereas the yellow territories, which they did not directly rule over, they still had trade rights in. This is pretty similar and a good way of describing the rule and the way which Britain ruled India. Because the pink territories in the maps from the previous slide show which territories were British provinces with a British government official, whereas the yellow territories were princely states where Indian princes continued to rule over them. Now this is different because the British indirectly ruled through these princes. Therefore, each prince, although they ruled their own way, had a contract with rights from the British government, which they were granted. Now, these rights varied per province, usually depending on size. The British managed to rule India relatively peacefully for 90 years using this method. However, the rebellion of 1947 and the successful independence movement that came with it had gradual leading up causes. The British rule and British rights that were granted to these princes in the princely states were slowly stripped away, slowly throughout the course of the British rule. That, as well as the British, continued a monopoly and continued jeopardizing the Indian economy the same way the British East India Company had. This was capped off by World War II, which, as the British witnessed, which as India witnessed, the British struggled mightily against the Germans, and India witnessed Britain barely able to maintain its freedom in its own mainland, whereas it still had control over India. Gandhi, famous for fasting and for his peaceful protesting methods, spearheaded the independence movement of 1947. The independence movement took the form of peaceful protesting, which was not only suggested but forced on by Gandhi. He opposed any Indian resistance that was violent in any way. And throughout the independence movement in 1947, Gandhi would do his best to eliminate the non-peaceful protesting. The peaceful protesting turned out to be successful, and India was granted independence from the British. However, there were factors from the British side who were in economic and political trouble and turmoil after World War II, which had them struggling in war. They needed less to control, and the territory which they granted independence was India, which they had already had fear of fighting anyway. In their weak state, they could not take a rebellion in many cases their own forces, which were Indian troops ruled by British officers. The turmoil in Britain, combined with their fear of rebellion from their own forces of native troops, led to British granting India independence in 1947. Throughout colonization and decolonization, there were lasting effects which have an impact on modern day India as we know it today. The main impact that was caused by colonization, or in this case decolonization, was Indian geography as we know it today. Now decolonization had this impact because nationalism developed as a result of rebellions. The rebellion of 1857 and the later more successful independence movement of 1947. Now, this nationalism was important to the modern geography of India because the separate princely states of India, which could have been considered as separate kingdoms or separate countries, they had no affiliation with each other, now had a common factor of being oppressively ruled by the British, and this united them under the identity of Indian rather than from whatever princely state they came from. This created a big united territory, which this big united territory is now the Indian subcontinent as we know it today. Geography aside, another impact that decolonization had on India was a free, unmonopolized economy, which India had not experienced since the first advances of the British East India Company in making territory. So, to sum up, the two main effects that colonization had on India today were the geography and a free, unmonopolized, unjeopardized economy. Indian colonization was very unique because of its process, which had economic roots, which grew into political roots, and the fact that it is such a massive country which was united through colonization, having been previously made up of unaffiliated kingdoms.